Manhattan, 1929, saw a bizarre multi-million-dollar race play out between banker George L. Ostrom and automotive industry tycoon Walter Chrysler. Both were determined to erect the tallest building in the world, no matter what. And so the year that followed saw the pair attempt to outdo one another in increasingly devious ways. It all came to a head when, at the last moment, Chrysler raised a 175-foot spire he had built in secret to the top of his building. The last second edition made his project the tallest and him officially the winner. It's a fun story, worthy of a few laughs at just how far multi-millionaires will go to have the biggest of something, though the story is a bit less humorous when you take into account that the feud was happening during the Great Depression. Skyscrapers are internationally seen as a symbol of prosperity, but just as quickly as the excessive structures are built, they're also abandoned. If anything, high-rise projects tend to be as much a symbol of prosperity as they are a reminder that economic success is often just temporary. Here are some of the most infamous abandoned skyscrapers in the world, and how they landed up being ghosts of failed dreams. In 1987, the ties between North Korea and Soviet Russia seemed enormously beneficial. The two countries were so prosperous, in fact, that construction on the gargantuan 333-meter, that's nearly 1,100-foot, 105-story Ryogyong Hotel kicked off. The hotel was intended as an architectural one-up on the recently opened South Korean-financed Westin Stamford Hotel in Singapore, with the idea being that when finished, the aesthetically impressive pyramid-shaped Ryogyong Hotel would be the tallest of its kind in the world. For extra prestige, the Ryogyong's 40-meter capping cone was intended to provide space for 5 luxury rotating restaurants, while the massive hotel wings would accommodate up to 7,665 guests. Thus, Soviet Russia and North Korea would prove once and for all that communist countries were as prosperous, if not more prosperous, than competing Western nations. Ryugyong Hotel Investment and Management was established prior to construction being started, and representatives set about attempting to raise $230 million in foreign venture capital. Communication with investors specified that oversight of the building would be relaxed, casinos and nightclubs would be allowed, and everyone would surely walk away wealthier. Now, perhaps the Ryugyong Hotel would have acted as a symbol of success if history had taken a really alternative path, but it didn't. And the worst happened, with the USSR collapsing and the Ryogyong Hotel being abandoned before the last leg of construction was ever finished. Soviet Russia had been subsidizing the entire hotel, so with that funding suddenly drying up, the project was left floundering. More to the point, North Korea was left in a devastating economic crisis. Thus, the planned symbol of prosperity ended up being a painfully obvious symbol of failure, with the unfinished hotel towering above the Pyongyang skyline as a constant, embarrassing reminder. For perspective, the hotel is estimated to have cost $750 million. That's about 2% of the whole of North Korea's GDP. But that isn't the end of the story, with things getting so much worse before they start to get any better. It was later revealed that had the hotel been finished on schedule, it likely would have been a disaster regardless. Rumors suggest that later in the 90s, following the fall of the USSR, the Korean European Chamber of Commerce had the building inspected to assess if there was any chance of salvage. According to their inspection, the quality of the concrete used was substandard. Many of the elevator shafts were misaligned, and all in all, serious renovations would be needed for the hotel to ever start accepting guests. But this didn't deter the North Korean government, who were adamant that Ryogyong Hotel would be finished. Following that, the construction site remained completely inactive for 16 years. The North Korean government, as it tends to do in times of embarrassment, ignored the unfinished building entirely. The decaying image of Ryogyong Hotel was removed from photos lest the great leader endure further embarrassment, and the location of the construction site was deleted from maps. It was during this time that international media began to refer to Ryogyong Hotel as the Hotel of Doom or the Phantom Hotel. Then, in April 2008, the situation finally took a turn. Egyptian construction firm Orascom Group entered into a reported $400 million contract with the North Korean government. The contract was, interestingly enough, primarily in regards to a cellular network, with the completion of the building apparently being part of an additional agreement. Either way, Orascom set about finishing Ryogyong Hotel, with early statements saying that the revolving restaurant would be incorporated, as well as several cellular communication towers. Construction would be done by 2012, North Korean officials boldly claimed, with the opening set to act as an appropriate tribute for the 100th birthday of the nation's eternal president. Construction continued over the following years, with updates coming in 2011 and 2012. At that time, it was reported that the exterior of the hotel had been finished, and only additional interior work remained. International hotel operator Kempinski stepped in to announce that it would operate the hotel on behalf of North Korea, though cautioned that the amenities would likely only be partially operational by mid-2013. So, the great leader didn't get his tribute after all. He shouldn't have felt too bad, though, because the project was again abandoned in early 2013. International tension soared to new heights as North Korea unexpectedly conducted an underground nuclear test in February 2013, quickly sending involved companies running for the hills. Both the Rascom Group and hotel operator Kempinski pulled out, with Kempinski simply stating that entering into the North Korean market was not possible at that time. The project sat dormant for an additional 4 years until life was once again seen at the construction site in 2016. An enormous LED display was added to one side of the towering structure, and as is the North Korean way, the screen promptly began to display the nation's flag plus a selection of short propaganda animations. Signage was added in 2019, and, well, that's more or less where things stand to this day. In 2024, the hotel remains unoccupied, though the LED displays do still play animations. The last update of any kind came in 2023, when a number of interior photos were unofficially released by Englishman Simon Cockerell. The images confirm that the interior of Ryogyong Hotel is still nothing more than vast, unfinished cement halls. The 190-meter, 624-foot, 45-story Torda David, otherwise known as the Centro Financiero con Venezuela, sits dormant in the capital of Venezuela, Caracas. The building was named after banker David Brillemborg, the primary investor who sadly passed away without ever seeing construction finish. His passing was perhaps a blessing in disguise, though, given that the Torda David never did finish and to this day remains a ghostly abandoned health hazard. The building did see occupation by one of the most elaborate squatter societies in Venezuelan history, though this probably would have been of little comfort to a man that intended on creating a monument to success. Construction on the Torda David started in 1990, with intention being that this enormous structure, complete with 121,741 square meter interior floor space and a helipad, would stand as testimony to Venezuela's achievements on the global market. As is a theme of this particular video, not long after a fortune was sunk into a symbol of success, Venezuela suffered the devastating 1994 banking crisis. Starting with Banco Latino, a total of 8 local banks declared themselves insolvent, plunging Venezuela into a crisis that worsened over the following decades. Now, to say Venezuela's economy degraded in the years that followed is putting it mildly. Most cite the government under then-President Hugo Chavez and the aggressive pushing of ill-conceived, hyper-populist reforms. Though widely reported corruption, mismanagement, and poor economic oversight probably also had something to do with it. Supporters of Chavez, meanwhile, claimed that the crisis was born from economic war perpetrated by foreign nations. Whatever the reasons for the initial crisis, the first signs that things were going wrong manifested with the collapse of the banking system in 1994. The government was forced to rescue a total of 8 banks, the cost of which is estimated to be around $12 billion. In total, 17 of the 49 commercial banks in Venezuela at that time failed, amounting to between 18 to 31% of the country's GDP being funneled into bailouts. Adding to the already dire situation was the allegations that many bankers simply took the bailout money and fled, terrified of facing the consequences of the unfolding crisis that they had helped to create. The nearly finished Torre David was, of course, promptly abandoned. The Venezuelan government did eventually take control of the project, though nothing was done with it since attention was desperately needed elsewhere. An attempt to auction off the building in 2001 failed, though that isn't exactly surprising. Then, in 2007, squatters began to take up residence in the decaying tower remnants. Construction of new homes in Venezuela had come to a halt by that time, with developers spooked by President Chavez enacting further populist ideologies, in this case the expropriation of privately owned assets to be reformed into state-owned assets. As such, land developers refused to cultivate more property, fearing that their investments would be forcibly taken. The result was a collapse of the real estate market and, by extension, a rapidly growing homelessness problem. The government itself, meanwhile, was not capable of building enough homes, thereby leaving around 400,000 Caracas citizens homeless. Around 200 families initially moved into the abandoned Torre David, with unofficial reports saying the squatters went to extraordinary lengths to make the space livable. Utility systems were rigged to provide water as high as the 22nd floor, while motorcycles were used to traverse modified steps in the absence of working elevators. As the years drew on, convenience stores, beauty salons, barbershops, and an unlicensed dentist all eventually took up residence in and around the tower, with peak squatter population estimated to be somewhere around 5,000. Finally, in July 2014, the government launched Operation Zamora, otherwise referred to as the Great Housing Mission. The 5,000 tower residents were gradually evicted over the course of several months, each assigned a new home in a rapidly built housing project located in Qua, south of Caracas. The housing mission went well according to the government, though there were reports that by the time the Torda David squatters arrived at their new homes, those residences themselves had already been occupied by a separate group of squatters. In 2014, a rumor circulated that Chinese banks were interested in buying the tower and renovating it for future use. Then President Nicolas Maduro responded to the rumors, saying that no decisions had been made on the tower, elaborating that there had been calls to demolish the structure given that it had become a serious health hazard. Later in 2015, Capital District head Ernesto Villegas declared that the building would be put to temporary use as an emergency center, with members of the National Guard and Fire Department set to move in shortly. This never came to pass, the Chinese deal ultimately fell through, and the Torda David was again left abandoned. As of 2024, the Torre David is still empty, and its resurrection is seeming increasingly less likely with each passing year. The superstructure suffered significant damage due to an earthquake in 2018, and now, more or less, the entire building is seen as a complete write-off. You might be surprised to hear, given what we've learned about the previous two buildings, that this is the first on the list that has a reputation for being haunted. Though once we get into the details of the Sathorn Unique Tower's truly fascinating but genuinely horrific history, you'll probably understand why. Construction of the 185-meter, 607-foot, 49-story Sathorn Unique Tower started in 1990, with intentions being that the finished structure would act as a luxury condominium for the affluent of Bangkok, Thailand. Thailand was undergoing an economic boom at the time, but, surprise, surprise, it wasn't going to last. Prominent architect and developer Rangsang Tasorwan was behind the project, having overseen the construction of many Thai skyscrapers during the 80s and 90s. His corporation, Sathorn Unique Co., was the driving force, which, at that time, was an enormously successful institute. Rangsang's architectural design philosophies, on the other hand, weren't always so universally successful. Take a closer look at the unfinished Sathorn Unique Tower, and you'll soon get an idea of the controversy, at least as far as the architectural world was concerned. Rangsang's designs incorporate Greek-inspired pillars and other bold decorations, all haphazardly fused together with other perhaps less compatible styles. Some like the results and refer to Rangsang's work as mesmerizing, but ask the architectural world and you'll hear his work referred to unflatteringly as architectural pastiche or ill-conceived Frankenstein's abominations. Regardless of how controversial the buildings were, and perhaps still are, Sathorn Unique Co. was never without work during the 80s and 90s. That prosperous streak came to an end in the early 90s, though. The trouble started in 1993, with Rangsang's arrest. In a bizarre turn of events, he was accused of plotting to murder the president of the Supreme Court, Praman Chansu, though even from the get-go, the allegations seemed thin to say the least. This court case, in itself, is an astounding story well worth its own video, but the nutshell version is that despite an overwhelming lack of evidence, the court case was drawn out for nearly 15 years. By 2006, the case had been heard an absurd 461 times by a total of 19 judges. There has been endless speculation as to what was really going on, with some believing that the real reason for Rangsang's arrest was a brewing conflict between his wife and the president of the Supreme Court. It has been pointed out that Thai courts can easily be manipulated for the interests of a few individuals, with blatant delay techniques sometimes used to turn a questionable case into a costly, multi-year affair. Whatever the truth of the allegations, Rangsang and his alleged accomplices were initially found guilty and sentenced to death. The death sentence was later reduced to 25 years in jail until in 2010 the original verdict was entirely overturned in the Court of Appeals and Rangsang was acquitted. Of course, immediately upon release, Rangsang set about attempting to finish his long-abandoned Unique Tower, but by that time found it virtually impossible to secure funding. On the other hand, regardless of being locked in a 15-year court case, Rangsang's Unique Tower may have struggled to see completion anyway. At about the time he was in his fourth year of fighting assassination allegations, the 1997 Asian financial crisis hit. Hundreds of in-progress construction projects throughout Thailand were put on hold, with estimates suggesting 300 unfinished buildings were left stranded in limbo. Many of the projects have since been finished following economic recovery, chief among them the State Tower, another of Rangsang's projects which is today rather prestigious. An interesting side note is that the State Tower was a sister project to the Sathorn Unique Tower, sharing many of the design philosophies Rangsang had been criticized for. So, what happened to the Sathorn Unique Tower while Rangsang was locked up in court? Well, there were some talks of the tower being refinanced after Rangsun's son, Pansit Torsuan, joined Sathorn Unique Co. in 2004, but Rangsun insisted that the building only be sold if enough was raised to repay the original investors, which, as it turned out, was far more than any interested party was willing to fork out. Hence, the massive 80% finished Sathorn Tower remained abandoned and is still abandoned to this day. And this brings us to the more disturbing and ghostly aspects of today's story. After initially being avoided by locals due to an infestation of drug addicts and vagrants in the 90s and early 2000s, today's Sathorn Unique Tower is avoided because locals simply refer to it as the Ghost Tower. The name is due to the discovery of the Swedish backpacker Stig Johan Christian Hammarsten in 2014. His body found hanged on the 43rd floor. A local photographer made the discovery, himself having entered to capture images of the sunset over Bangkok. The photographer instead decided to post pictures of the body to social media. Stig's death was ruled a suicide, but not only did rumors of hauntings kick into sixth gear, debates began to rage as to why security at the derelict site was so lacking. The truth was that Sathorn Unique Tower had been officially deemed off-limits for decades, but that hadn't stopped hundreds of urban explorers, parkour athletes, and other adventurers from bribing security guards to gain access. The tower is a veritable thrill-seekers hotspot, and even today you'll see videos regularly posted of YouTubers exploring the tower, recording themselves performing hair-raising parkour stunts, or claiming to have encountered the ghost, because of course they did, it's on YouTube. Now, the developing social media frenzy certainly didn't go unnoticed by Pansit Torsuan. To combat the thrill seekers, after declaring that the situation was fast getting out of control and would likely result in another death, he officially filed criminal charges of trespassing against a group that had posted parkour videos. According to Pansit, on some occasions, as many as 100 tourists had been entering the property over a single weekend, most of which had been tempting death with ridiculous stunts. As well-meaning as Pansit's intentions were, he clearly didn't understand how social media works. Laying criminal charges didn't do much to deter thrill-seekers, and in fact it only served as an extremely effective marketing campaign. Thrill-seeker numbers increased, and it seems that at a certain point Pansit decided to simply go with it. He gave permission for the 2017 horror film The Promise to be shot on the premises, and the movie, of course, fueled an even greater interest. Today there are conflicting reports as to whether paying tourists are or aren't legally allowed onto the premises, but either way, Sathorn Tower remains one of the most popular thrill-seeker destinations in the world, even if its decaying presence must be an ongoing heartache for the now 85-year-old Rangsun. From one fascinating story to another, last on our list is the 162-meter or 531-foot, 45-story Plaza Tower located in New Orleans. Of all the skyscrapers that we've mentioned so far, if you're the kind to believe in curses rather than ghosts, well, the Plaza Tower is ready to make those beliefs justified. Construction of Plaza Tower started in 1964, only to be halted in 1966 due to the bankruptcy of original developer Sam J. Rasile. A great start, and the best dramatic foreshadowing you could ask for. The project was sold, construction resumed in 1968 and finished in 1969. Upon completion, the Plaza Tower was the tallest in New Orleans and all of Louisiana, though only for 4 brief years. One Shell Square, today Hancock Whitney Center, took the crown, leaving Plaza Hotel as a distant runner-up. What the Plaza Tower did achieve, however, and continued to achieve for decades, was the triggering of a high-rise boom that swept New Orleans. There was a building boom along nearby Canal Street in the 70s, followed by a second boom along Poydras Street in the 80s, but sadly it was about this time that Plaza Tower began to get a reputation for lack of upkeep and maintenance. Throughout the 90s, grumblings were heard from various occupying businesses, with reports of leaks and failing infrastructure becoming a regular occurrence. The complaints grew steadily louder until in 2001, allegations of asbestos and toxic mold made Louisiana headlines. Numerous class action lawsuits were filed, and the Louisiana Department of Social Services and Louisiana Department of Health and Hospitals were suddenly thrust into the spotlight. Investigations revealed that, indeed, the Plaza Tower was not only in a dire condition, but the inhabitants were in serious danger of inhaling potentially deadly mold and asbestos. 2002 saw 700 employees occupying the building swiftly relocate to a new office, followed by Plaza Tower being sealed, deemed uninhabitable, and remaining abandoned to this day. But brace yourself, because this is just the start of the building's cursed journey. There were first some signs of a reconstruction in the mid to late 2000s, with talk of deadly mold replaced by a plan to refinance the health hazard and reopen it as Crescent City Towers. The proposition involved luxury accommodations for the wealthy, and according to Williams Architects of New Orleans and Marks Thomas Architects of Baltimore, Plaza Tower was to be stripped down to its core, the existing health problems remedied, and an entirely new structure to be erected from the ground up. This project, had it succeeded, would have seen 350 luxury units selling at around $350,000 each. But you can probably guess that things didn't go according to plan. Hurricane Katrina hit in 2005 and construction plans were temporarily put on hold. To their credit, involved companies seemed undeterred and quickly announced that the project would go ahead, albeit with dramatic modifications to address concerns about future hurricane disasters. But promises of new hurricane-proof windows weren't enough to dispel fears, especially with the cost of each residence now pushed up to $450,000. So the $120 million Crescent City Towers project failed even before it got started. Plaza Towers passed hands in July 2007 to new owners, Plainfield Direct, who set about paying $608,000 in back taxes and committing an additional $10 million to cleaning up the still remaining deadly asbestos and toxic mold. Work finished successfully, and Plainfield District sought partners to kick the new project into gear. By 2011, Plainfield District put the building up for auction. It sold to investor Brian Burns, who reportedly paid only $650,000 against the listed value of $15.5 million. Burns sold the building to Joe Yeager of Alexandra Land and Development in 2014 for an undisclosed amount. Keep in mind that Plaza Tower had been built in the 60s and at this point had essentially not received proper structural maintenance since first opening. So, try to act surprised that debris fell from the building and injured one person in 2021. Major roads in New Orleans were closed due to fear of further collapse, and all eyes turned to owner Joe Yeager. He assured that safety nets would be erected to catch additional debris, paid for out of his own pocket, and promptly got back to ignoring the building entirely. A fire was reported in 2022, the New Orleans Fire Department extinguishing the blaze, but warned that something had to be done immediately to avoid future incidents. Nothing was done, and in January 2023, more debris fell from the building, and roads were again closed. Later that same year, another fire broke out, this time believed to be a trash pile accidentally set ablaze by squatters. Hours after the second fire was extinguished, an unnamed squatter fell from the building and died. This horrendous death, avoidable if proper security had been implemented, is the last time Plaza Tower made news. The chances are good that we'll be hearing about this death trap again soon, especially since Mayor Latoya Cantrell mentioned that the current plans are to demolish the entire property ASAP. Interestingly, Plaza Tower has never been referred to as haunted, but maybe it's just a matter of time before something bad enough happens to really get those YouTube superstition juices flowing.